The truth about struggling, no one tells you. Is that the hardest part? Isn't what's happening around you, it's what's happening inside you? You're still praying, still trying, still holding on to God, but your mind won't quiet down. The questions keep coming, the weight doesn't lift, and you hate that thought that keeps showing up. If God is with me, why does this still feel so heavy? You thought faith would bring peace by now, clarity, relief, but instead, it feels like a constant, quiet fight between what you believe and what you feel. And the more you try to trust, the more exposed your fears become. The more you seek God, the louder the silence feels. So now, you're stuck in this tension, wondering if you're doing something wrong, or if something deeper is happening that you don't understand yet. But what if the struggle you're in right now isn't a sign that your faith is failing, but a sign that something inside you is finally being revealed? You've been trying. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but sincerely. You've been praying, holding on, choosing faith, even when your mind feels crowded with questions. And yet, something still feels heavy. It's not always obvious on the outside. You go through your day, you handle your responsibilities, you show up where you need to, but internally, there's a quiet tension that never fully leaves. A weight that sits somewhere between your thoughts and your spirit. You expected that walking with God would feel different than this. You thought there would be more peace, more clarity, more certainty. But instead, there are moments when your mind won't slow down. You replay situations, you overthink decisions, you question whether you're doing the right thing. And sometimes, in the middle of it all, a thought rises that you don't even want to admit. If God is really with me, why does this feel so hard? It's not rebellion. It's not that you've turned away. If anything, you've been trying to lean in more. You've been holding on to faith, even when your emotions don't cooperate. But that's exactly what makes it confusing. Because you expected alignment. You expected that faith would quiet the storm inside your mind. That trusting God would somehow make things smoother, clearer, lighter. And when that doesn't happen, something begins to feel off. You start wondering if you're missing something. Maybe you're not praying the right way. Maybe your faith isn't strong enough. Maybe God is distant or silent or waiting for you to figure something out before he responds. And that silence, that's what makes everything louder. Because when God doesn't seem to answer, your thoughts try to fill the gap. And they don't always tell the truth. They whisper things like, "You should be further along by now. If God was really working, things would look different. Maybe you're doing something wrong." And slowly, without realizing it, the battle shifts. It's no longer just about your circumstances. It becomes a battle inside your mind. A tension between what you believe and what you feel. You believe God is present, but you feel alone. You believe he has a plan, but you feel stuck. You'll believe he hears your prayers, but you feel unheard. And that contradiction is exhausting because you're trying to hold on to truth while your emotions keep pulling you in the opposite direction. You don't want to doubt, but questions keep rising. You don't want to feel this way, but the heaviness doesn't just disappear. So you keep going, quietly, internally wrestling with things you don't always talk about. And maybe the hardest part is this. You thought following God would remove this kind of struggle. That once you committed, once you trusted, once you stepped into faith, things would begin to fall into place. But instead, it feels like something else is happening. Like the more you try to trust, the more aware you become of your fears. Like the more you seek clarity, the more questions surface. Like the more you pray, the more you notice the silence. And it leads you to a question that sits deeper than all the others. Why does following God still feel like a fight? Not a loud, dramatic fight, but a quiet, constant one. A fight to keep trusting, a fight to keep believing, a fight to not let your thoughts pull you away from what you know is true. Because deep down, you do believe. That's what makes this so difficult. If you didn't care, it wouldn't hurt like this. If your faith didn't matter to you, you wouldn't feel this tension. But you do care. And that's why the struggle feels so personal, so real, so constant. And maybe you've wondered, without saying it out loud, Is something wrong with me? Or is there something about this that I don't understand yet? Because what if the difficulty you're experiencing isn't a sign that something is broken, but a sign that something deeper is happening? And if that's true, then why does it feel this confusing? What if the struggle you're feeling right now isn't a sign that your faith is failing, but a sign that something deeper is being revealed? Because here's what most people don't realize. Pressure doesn't create what's inside you, it exposes it. And that changes everything. You see, it's easy to believe that you trust God when life feels stable, when your plans are working, when your emotions are calm, when your path seems clear. In those moments, faith feels natural, almost effortless. But when things become uncertain, when your thoughts become restless, when your prayers don't seem to bring immediate peace, something else begins to surface. Doubt, fear, insecurity. Not because they suddenly appeared, but because they were already there, hidden beneath the surface. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because when those feelings rise, your first instinct might be to think, I shouldn't feel this way. If my faith was strong, I wouldn't be struggling like this. Something must be wrong with me spiritually. But what if that's not the truth? What if what you're experiencing isn't weakness, but exposure? Think about it this way. You can't heal what you refuse to see. And many times, God allows pressure not to push you away, but to reveal what's been quietly shaping your thoughts all along. The fears you didn't realize were guiding your decisions. The need for control you didn't notice was driving your anxiety, the subtle belief that things only feel safe when you understand what's happening. These things don't always show up in easy seasons. They show up when things feel uncertain. And that's exactly why this season feels so intense. Because it's not just about what's happening around you. It's about what's being uncovered within you. And that can feel uncomfortable. Because now, instead of just dealing with external situations, you're facing internal realities. You're seeing patterns in your thinking. You're noticing how quickly your mind jumps to worst-case scenarios. You're realizing how much your peace has been tied to outcomes you can't control. And if you're honest, that realization can feel discouraging because it doesn't match the version of yourself you thought you were. You thought your faith was stronger. You thought your trust was deeper. You thought you had already grown past this, but now it feels like you're back in the same place, asking the same questions, fighting the same internal battles, and the temptation is to see this as failure. But it's not. It's clarity, because God doesn't expose things to shame you. He reveals them to transform you. There's a difference. Shame says, you're not enough. Look at how far you still have to go. But truth says, now you can see what needs to change, and you're not facing it alone. And maybe that's the part that's hard to accept, because exposure feels vulnerable. It forces you to admit things you would rather ignore. It brings you face to face with thoughts that don't align with what you believe. And in those moments, the internal tension increases. You believe God is in control, but you feel like everything is uncertain. You believe He is trustworthy, but your mind keeps searching for reassurance. You believe He has a plan, but you still feel the urge to figure everything out on your own. And that tension, it can feel exhausting, like you're being pulled in two different directions at the same time. One part of you wants to rest in faith. The other part keeps trying to regain control. And here's the question that naturally follows. If God is working in your life, why would He allow this kind of internal struggle? Why not just give you peace instantly? Why not remove the fear instead of letting it surface? Why allow you to feel this exposed? The answer isn't always immediate, but here's something to consider. Instant peace might calm your emotions, but it wouldn't necessarily transform your mind. And God isn't just interested in how you feel in the moment. He's working on something deeper, something more lasting. Because if your peace only exists when circumstances make sense, then it's not really peace, it's control. And control will always be fragile. It will always depend on things going your way. But real peace, the kind that remains even when things are unclear, that kind of peace has to be built differently. And sometimes that process begins with exposure, with seeing clearly what's been shaping your thoughts behind the scenes. Not so you can feel worse about yourself, but so you can begin to think differently, to recognize the patterns, to challenge the assumptions, to slowly separate what you feel from what is actually true. And that takes time. It doesn't happen instantly, which leads to another question. If God is revealing these things in you, why does he seem so quiet while it's happening? Why does it feel like you're going through this without clear direction? Because if it's working, why doesn't he just say something? Why the silence? There's something deeply uncomfortable about not hearing clearly from God when you feel like you need him the most. It's one thing to face internal struggles. It's another thing to face them in what feels like silence. Because if God would just speak clearly, directly, undeniably, it feels like everything would settle. Your thoughts would slow down. Your direction would become clear. The tension inside you would finally release. But that's not always what happens. Instead, you pray, and nothing obvious changes. You wait, and there's no immediate answer. You search for clarity, and all you feel is quiet. And that quiet can feel confusing, because it doesn't match your expectation of how God should respond. You thought his guidance would feel more obvious. You thought his presence would feel more tangible. You thought that if you were truly seeking him, the answers would come quickly and clearly. But instead, you're left with something else. Stillness. And in that stillness, your thoughts get louder. Your questions multiply. Your emotions fluctuate. And it leads you to wonder if God is truly here. Why does he feel so silent? But what if the silence isn't what it seems? What if it's not absence, but intention? Because there's a subtle but important truth that often gets overlooked. God doesn't always speak in ways that remove the need for trust. In fact, many times, he speaks in ways that require it, and that changes how you see silence. Because maybe the issue isn't that God hasn't spoken. Maybe it's that he's not speaking in the way you expected. Think about this carefully. You're looking for something new direction, new clarity, new answers. But what if God is pointing you back to something he has already said? Something steady, something foundational, something that doesn't change based on your current situation. Because it's possible to overlook what is already true while searching for something new. And in that process, silence begins to feel louder than it actually is. But God's way of growing your faith isn't always through constant new instructions. Sometimes it's through learning to trust what has already been revealed, to hold on to truth, even when your feelings don't reinforce it, to move forward, even when you don't have every detail mapped out. And that's where the tension begins, because your mind wants certainty. It wants reassurance. It wants something concrete to hold on to in the moment. But faith doesn't always operate that way. Faith often asks you to trust without having full clarity, to continue without having complete understanding, to believe even when your emotions are unsettled. And that can feel frustrating, because it feels like you're being asked to move forward without enough information, like you're walking without seeing the full path, like you're holding on without knowing when things will change. And naturally, part of you resists that, because you want to feel secure before you move. You want to feel confident before you trust. You want to feel peace before you let go. But what if it doesn't work in that order? What if peace doesn't come before trust, but through it? What if clarity doesn't come before movement, but after it? What if God's silence isn't preventing your growth, but actually creating the space for it? Because when everything is clear, trust isn't stretched. When every answer is immediate, faith isn't developed. When every step is explained, dependence isn't necessary. But in silence, something different happens. You begin to notice what you're truly relying on. You begin to see whether your faith is rooted in feelings or in truth. You begin to confront the question, do I trust God or do I only trust clarity? And that's not an easy question to sit with, because it reveals something deeper than you expected. It shows you that maybe the struggle isn't just about wanting answers, but about wanting control, wanting to know what's coming, wanting to feel certain about outcomes, wanting to remove the discomfort of not knowing. And there's nothing unusual about that. It's human, but it also reveals why silence feels so difficult. Because silence removes the illusion of control. It takes away the constant reassurance. It leaves space where your trust has to become active, not just theoretical. And that's where faith begins to grow differently. Not as a feeling, but as a decision. A quiet, internal decision to trust what you know is true, even when you don't feel it, to hold on to what God has said, even when He's not saying something new, to continue forward, even when the path isn't fully clear. And that kind of faith, it doesn't always feel strong. Sometimes it feels uncertain. Sometimes it feels fragile. Sometimes it feels like you're just barely holding on. But that doesn't mean it's not real. In fact, that might be where it becomes the most real, because it's no longer dependent on constant emotional confirmation. It's rooted in something deeper, something steady, something that doesn't shift with every thought or feeling. But here's where the question still lingers. If silence is part of how God builds trust, then why does the waiting that comes with it feel so long? Why does it feel like you're stuck in the same place, praying the same prayers, facing the same internal battles, without seeing clear movement? Because silence is one thing, but waiting, that's something else entirely. And if God is using both, then what is He actually doing in the delay? Waiting has a way of stretching time in a way nothing else does. It's not just about minutes or days. Passing it's about the feeling of being in the same place, internally and externally, longer than you expected. You thought things would shift by now. You thought you would feel different by now. You thought God would have made something clearer by now. But here you are, still thinking about the same questions, still carrying the same tension, still trying to understand what God is doing. And the longer it lasts, the more a certain thought begins to form. Am I stuck? Because waiting can feel like a lack of movement, like nothing is changing, like your prayers are just echoing into silence without response. And slowly, frustration begins to build, not always loudly, but quietly. Underneath everything else, you keep showing up in faith. You keep trying to trust, but part of you is asking, how long is this going to take? And maybe even more honestly, why is this taking so long? Because if God has the power to change things instantly, why doesn't He? If He sees your struggle, why allow it to continue? If He hears your prayers, why delay the answer? These questions don't come from a place of rebellion. They come from a place of longing, a desire for resolution, for clarity, for relief. And yet, the waiting continues. But what if waiting isn't what it feels like? What if it's not a pause in your life, but a process within it? Because one of the most subtle misunderstandings about waiting is this. We think nothing is happening simply because nothing is changing externally. But God's work is not always external first. Many times, it's internal, and internal work is harder to measure. You can't always see it. You can't always track progress. You can't always feel the shift immediately. But that doesn't mean nothing is happening. In fact, some of the most important changes happen in ways that are almost invisible at first. Changes in how you think, changes in what you value, changes in how you respond to uncertainty. And those changes don't happen instantly. They require time, because God isn't just trying to give you something. He's preparing you for it. And preparation often takes longer than you expect, not because God is slow, but because transformation is deep. Think about this carefully. If everything you're asking for was given to you immediately, would your mindset be ready to sustain it? Would your trust be strong enough to carry it? Would your dependence on God remain or slowly fade? These are uncomfortable questions, but they reveal something important. Sometimes the delay is not about the thing you're waiting for. It's about the person you're becoming while you wait. Because God's priority isn't just your situation, it's your formation, who you are becoming in the process. And that process often involves realignment, letting go of certain expectations, releasing timelines you've created in your mind, adjusting desires that may not fully align with God's purpose. And that doesn't happen quickly, because letting go is not easy. You don't just release control overnight. You don't instantly stop needing certainty. You don't immediately feel comfortable with not knowing. That shift takes time, and waiting creates the space for it. But here's where the tension deepens, because even if you understand that waiting has a purpose, it doesn't automatically make it easier. You still feel the weight of it. You still notice the lack of visible progress. You still wrestle with the same internal questions. And part of you still wonders, what if nothing changes? What if I'm waiting for something that never happens? What if I'm misunderstanding everything? These thoughts can be unsettling because they challenge your sense of direction. They make you question whether you're moving forward or just standing still. And this is where waiting becomes more than just time passing. It becomes a test of perspective, because you can either see waiting as emptiness or as preparation. You can either interpret it as delay or as development. But that shift in perspective doesn't happen automatically. It requires something deeper. It requires surrender, not passive resignation, but active trust. A willingness to say, I don't fully understand what's happening, but I trust that God is doing something. And that's not easy to say when you don't see results. It's not easy to believe when your emotions don't align. It's not easy to hold on when nothing seems to be moving. But this is where something important begins to form. A different kind of faith, not based on immediate outcomes, but on steady trust. And that kind of faith doesn't grow in moments of instant answers. It grows in the tension of waiting. But this leads to another question. If waiting is shaping you, if God is using this time to prepare you, then why does it often feel like you're reaching your limit? Why does it feel like you don't have the strength to keep holding on the same way? Because at some point, waiting doesn't just test your patience, it exposes your weakness. And that's where things begin to shift in a completely different way. Waiting for your confirmation to continue with Block 5. There comes a point in the process where waiting doesn't just feel long, it starts to feel heavy. Not just mentally, but deeply, like something inside you is getting tired. You've been holding on. You've been trying to stay grounded in faith. You've been reminding yourself of what is true. But now it feels different. Because you're not just waiting anymore, you're reaching your limit. And that realization can be unsettling because it forces you to confront something you don't always want to admit. I don't feel as strong as I thought I was. And that thought can go in two directions. It can either lead you into discouragement or into something deeper. But most people initially feel the discouragement because somewhere along the way, you learn to associate strength with having everything under control, with staying steady no matter what, with not being shaken by circumstances or emotions. So when you begin to feel overwhelmed, when your thoughts become harder to manage, when your emotional energy starts to fade, it feels like you're failing. Like you're not handling this the way you should. Like your faith isn't as solid as you believed. But what if that definition of strength was never accurate to begin with? What if real strength was never about holding everything together on your own? Because the truth is, self-reliance can look like strength for a while, until it reaches its limit. And that's exactly what you may be experiencing now. Not because you're weak in a negative sense, but because you're human. And there's a limit to how much you can carry by yourself. A limit to how much control you can maintain. A limit to how much certainty you can create through your own thinking. And when you reach that limit, something important is revealed. Not just your weakness, but your need. Your need for something beyond yourself. Your need for God, not just as an idea, not just as a belief, but as a real source of strength. And this is where everything begins to shift. Because as long as you feel capable of managing everything on your own, dependence on God can remain theoretical, something you agree with, but don't fully live out. But when your own strength starts to feel insufficient, dependence becomes real, not as a concept, but as a necessity. And that's uncomfortable because it requires letting go of control in a deeper way. Not just in your circumstances, but in your internal world. Letting go of the need to figure everything out. Letting go of the pressure to hold everything together perfectly. Letting go of the belief that you have to feel strong in order to be okay. And that's where the tension increases again, because part of you still wants to regain control, to fix the feeling, to stabilize everything through your own effort. But another part of you is starting to realize that approach isn't working the same way anymore. That no matter how much you think, how much you analyze, how much you try to mentally solve everything, there's still a gap, a space that your own strength can't fill. And that's not a failure, that's an invitation. An invitation to experience God differently. Not just as someone who guides you when things are clear, but as someone who sustains you when they're not. Not just as someone who gives direction, but as someone who gives strength. And that strength doesn't always come in the way you expect. It doesn't always remove the struggle instantly. It doesn't always change your situation right away. But it begins to support you within it, quietly, steadily, in ways that are not always dramatic, but deeply real. And this is where something subtle begins to happen. Instead of asking, how do I fix this? You begin to ask, how do I stay grounded in this? Instead of trying to eliminate the discomfort immediately, you begin to learn how to move through it with God. And that shift is significant because it moves you from control to dependence, from self-reliance to trust. But it also raises a deeper question. If God's strength becomes most real in your weakness, why does it take reaching this point to experience it? Why not just feel it from the beginning? Why allow the process to go this far? Because if this is where transformation happens, why does it require you to feel like you're at your limit first? And more importantly, what changes when you finally stop trying to hold everything together on your own? Something begins to change the moment you stop trying to hold everything together on your own. Not all at once, not in a dramatic, emotional breakthrough, but quietly, internally. Something shifts because for a long time, the question driving your thoughts has been, why is this happening to me? Why is it so hard? Why does it feel like God is silent? Why hasn't anything changed yet? And those questions are natural. They come from confusion, from discomfort, from a desire to understand. But they also keep your focus in one direction on the situation, on the struggle, on what feels unresolved. And as long as your focus stays there, the tension remains the same. Because you're measuring everything based on what is or isn't changing around you. But then, something subtle happens. Not because everything suddenly makes sense, but because you begin to ask a different question. What is God doing in me? And that question changes the direction of your attention. It doesn't ignore your situation. It doesn't pretend the struggle isn't real, but it shifts the focus from external outcomes to internal transformation. And that shift is where clarity begins. Because now, instead of only looking for answers, you begin to notice patterns. You begin to see how your thoughts have been shaped. You begin to recognize how your reactions have been driven by fear, by control, by the need for certainty. Not in a way that condemns you, but in a way that reveals something important. You're starting to see yourself more clearly. And that clarity, while uncomfortable at first, becomes the foundation for change. Because now, instead of reacting automatically, you can pause. You can question the thoughts that once felt unquestionable. You can begin to separate what you feel from what is true. And that's where your mind starts to renew. Not instantly, not perfectly, but progressively, one thought at a time, one moment of awareness at a time, one decision to trust, even when it feels uncertain. And slowly, something else begins to happen. The same situations that once triggered anxiety start to feel different. Not because they've disappeared, but because your perspective is changing. You're no longer expecting immediate clarity in order to move forward. You're no longer waiting to feel completely confident before you trust. You're no longer trying to control every outcome in order to feel okay. Instead, you're learning to stay grounded even when things are unclear, to move forward even when you don't have every answer, to trust God not because everything makes sense, but because you're beginning to see that He's been working, even when you didn't notice it. And that realization is powerful because it reframes everything you've been experiencing. The struggle that once felt like a setback now begins to look like preparation. The silence that once felt like distance now begins to feel like space where your faith was being strengthened. The waiting that once felt like delay now begins to feel like development. And that doesn't mean everything suddenly feels easy. You still have moments of doubt. You still have thoughts that try to pull you back into old patterns. You still feel the tension at times. But something is different now, because those thoughts no longer feel absolute. They no longer define your direction. They're just thoughts. And you're learning that you don't have to follow all of them, that you can acknowledge them without being controlled by them. And that's a form of freedom, a quiet, internal freedom, not from your circumstances, but within them. And this is where fear begins to lose its grip, not because it disappears completely, but because it's no longer the loudest voice. Trust begins to grow, steadily, quietly, not based on feelings, but based on truth. And that kind of trust changes how you move forward. Because now, instead of asking, "When will this end?" you begin to ask, "How can I stay aligned with God in this moment?" Instead of focusing on how long it's taking, you focus on how He responding. Instead of needing to understand everything, you choose to remain grounded in what you already know is true. And that's the turning point. Not the moment when everything changes externally, but the moment when something changes internally. Because once your perspective shifts, your experience of the process shifts with it. And that leads to the final realization. If God has been working through the struggle, the silence, the waiting, and even your weakness, then what does that say about everything you've been through? Was it all unnecessary, or was it all part of something intentional? And if it was intentional, then what does it mean for how you move forward now? When you look back now, even if nothing around you has fully changed yet, something within you has. And that changes everything. Because the question that once carried so much weight, "Why is this so hard?" no longer feels the same. Not because you have every answer, not because the struggle completely disappeared, but because you see it differently now. You understand something you couldn't see before. The difficulty was never proof that God was absent. It was often the very place where He was working the most. Quietly, patiently, intentionally. Every moment of was revealing where your trust needed to grow. Every moment of silence was teaching you to rely on what God had already spoken. Every season of waiting was reshaping your priorities and your perspective. Every moment of weakness was inviting you to experience His strength in a real, personal way. And none of that was wasted. Not a single part of it. Even the moments that felt confusing. Even the days that felt heavy. Even the thoughts that made you question everything. They were all part of a process you couldn't fully see at the time. But now, you're starting to recognize it. And that recognition brings something unexpected. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from having everything figured out, but the kind that comes from knowing you don't have to. Because your faith is no longer built on constant clarity. It's built on something deeper, something steadier, something that doesn't shift every time your emotions do. You've learned that feelings can be real, but not always reliable. You've learned that thoughts can be loud, but not always true. You've learned that God can be working, even when He feels silent, and that changes how you move forward. Because now, you're not waiting for the struggle to end in order to trust. You're choosing to trust within it. You're not depending on perfect conditions to feel grounded. You're learning to stay grounded regardless of conditions. And that's a different kind of strength. Not the kind that comes from controlling everything, but the kind that comes from surrendering what you can't. And there's freedom in that. A quiet, steady freedom. The kind that doesn't need constant reassurance. The kind that doesn't collapse when things feel uncertain. The kind that allows you to breathe again, even in the middle of unanswered questions. Because now you know, God was never distant. He was never ignoring you. He was never waiting for you to get it right before He responded. He was shaping something in you, strengthening something in you, forming a kind of faith that isn't easily shaken. And that kind of faith, it doesn't come from easy seasons. It's formed in moments exactly like the ones you've been through. So when the struggle comes again, and it will, in different forms, who won't see it the same way? You may still feel it. You may still wrestle at times. But deep down, there will be something steady reminding you, this is not the absence of God. This is where He works. And that truth will anchor you. Not perfectly, not without moments of tension, but with a growing sense of trust that wasn't there before. So you keep moving forward, not with all the answers, but with clarity about what matters, not with complete certainty, but with confidence in who God is. And that is enough. If this spoke to something you've been feeling, take a moment to reflect on it. You don't have to rush the process you're in. And if you want to continue growing in this kind of understanding, consider subscribing and staying connected for more content like this. And as you move forward, carry this with you. The place that feels like struggle may actually be the place where your faith is becoming real.